On a humid Alabama morning in 1915, the sheriff's deputies forced open the rotted door of a forgotten cabin at the edge of Plateau. Inside, they found a single wooden chair, still warm, rocking as though someone had just stood up, even though the cabin had been sealed for over 50 years. In the dirt beneath the chair lay a message, carved with frantic hands. He never left. This was the moment the quiet town of Plateau realized that its oldest secret, one older than the Civil War, older than abolition, was waking again. This story never appeared in newspapers. It slipped through archives, spoken only in whispers, passed down by families who swore they saw shadows move in the wrong direction, heard a voice humming in a language no one recognized, or found sand, foreign, ocean sand, piled at their doorsteps. They said it all led back to one man, a man the town dared not mention aloud after sunset, a man named Cudjoe, but not the man history knows. This Cudjoe was something else. What the people of Alabama believed about him was not tied to flesh or birth records. It was tied to an event in 1865, a night so violent in silence, so heavy in dread, that everyone who survived pretended it never happened. Tonight, we opened the sealed cabin. Tonight, we read the message carved in the dirt. Tonight, we follow the trail of the man who never left. And we learn the truth that survived 50 years after abolition, because something refused to let it die. Most people in Plateau knew the real Cudjoe Lewis, historically documented, photographed, interviewed. But the Cudjoe of this story is not that man. He is a shadow stitched into the town's memory, a name borrowed because the truth was too frightening to record. And so they hid it beneath a familiar identity. The story says that in 1860, when a group of newly freed men settled near the swampy outskirts of Mobile, one extra man appeared with them, yet no one remembered bringing him aboard. He was barefoot, covered in river mud, his clothes torn, his hair dripping as though he had just climbed out of the sea. When they asked his name, he spoke in a dialect no one recognized. The older men, deeply superstitious after the terror of the Middle Passage, whispered that the newcomer looked like someone they had buried during the journey. A man whose body had slipped into the ocean 40 days before landfall. A man who had drowned with his eyes open. But this man breathed, walked, ate, slept. Except, he never blinked. Those who spent time with him noticed unsettling details in small ways. His footprints filled with water instead of dirt. His breath came out cold even in the humid Alabama summer. He didn't respond to his own reflection. And he hummed at night, low, slow, in a rhythm that made people's skin rise. By the time the Civil War ended, no one dared question where he came from. And yet, in the years after abolition, something began to follow him. Birds dead in groups of 7. Church bells ringing at night without wind. Children waking up screaming in languages they never learned. And slowly, the town began to believe that the man who had arrived twice did not come back alone. Plateau was a town built on silence. After the Civil War, it became a place where nothing written ever matched what was spoken, and what was spoken never matched what was remembered. Families lived with locked basements. Churches stored documents no one opened. Schools skipped entire years of local history. People didn't bury certain stories, they smothered them. Yet one piece of the town's past was too heavy to hide completely. It clung to the air. It showed itself in the way church mothers crossed themselves twice instead of once. The way elders never stood with their backs to the river. The way no one said the name Cudjoe unless they were indoors, away from mirrors. The white residents claimed superstition, ignorance, folklore. But black elders, those who whispered on porches at dusk, spoke differently. They said the town had made a pact. Not a written pact. Not a spiritual pact. A psychological one. A pact of collective forgetting. Every generation agreed to erase the same night. A night in 1865 when the river rose higher than any year before, and the sky went silent, and something moved through the streets like a memory that refused to stay dead. When the children asked what happened that night, the elders responded the same way. Don't open what was meant to stay shut. But the cabin on the edge of the swamp, Cudjoe's cabin, remained. Boarded, locked, untouched, until 1915, until the rocking chair moved. 2 decades after the Civil War, the Plateau Orphan Society was built near the riverbank. It took in children from storms, epidemics, and families displaced by drought. The building was simple, wooden beams, handmade windows, a bell tower donated by the Methodist Church. At first, the orphanage was a symbol of hope. Then the humming began. It started in the hallways just before sunrise, a slow, rhythmic vibration in the floorboards, almost like someone dragging a wet rope across the planks. The children believed it was the river speaking. The caretakers blamed humidity. But every morning, the children in room 7 woke up crying. One child, barely 6, whispered to the matron that a man stood by the window each night, humming to himself, his shadow stretching across the entire wall, even when the moon was gone. When she asked what the man looked like, the child answered, "I didn't see his face. He kept it behind me." The matron brushed it off as nightmares. But when she finally inspected the room, she found something under the bed frame: wet footprints. Small feet. Bare feet. Feet that faced the wrong direction. The matron moved room 7 to a different wing. But the humming followed. And one night, when a storm snapped open the shutters, the children saw a figure standing in the yard, still, silent, staring up at them. He looked like the stories of Cudjoe, but older, wetter, thinner. The matron shut the blinds. The humming grew louder. Plateau's oldest church, St. Augustine's Chapel, kept records of almost every birth, marriage, and death since 1824. But in 1879, the pastor at the time, Reverend Matthew Crow, ordered that an entire decade of documents be sealed and stored in a chest beneath the altar. Nobody questioned him. But after his death, his successor discovered something chilling. The sealed chest contained not paper, but torn pages, soaked through, as though submerged in water for years. Ink ran like veins across the parchment, and almost every page held the same repeated phrase: "He will return through the last mouth that speaks his name." The church kept the chest hidden. They built a new altar over the old one. They repainted the basement walls. They told no one. But people noticed strange behaviors among the clergy. Priests avoided funerals held near the river. Choir singers refused to practice alone. And every pastor who served the church between 1879 and 1895 resigned quietly, claiming, "The building listens at night." One diary, later recovered, contained a final entry by a deacon: "Something in this town is waiting. Something unfinished." If the elders knew what really happened in 1865, they chose silence for a reason. And now the walls have learned to keep secrets too. After that year, even the bell tower ceased ringing before dawn. Because every time it did, people said they heard the humming again. The elders always said the river was the first warning. One night in 1865, no exact date was ever recorded, the river went completely still. Not slow, not calm, still, as if paused by something watching from beneath the surface. Fishermen reported the soundlessness first. Their boats glided like they were floating above glass. Not a single ripple formed beneath their oars. Then the temperature dropped. Birds flew in circles above the water but never landed. Dogs hid beneath houses, refusing to come out. Families bolted their doors even though there had been no threat, just a pressure in the air, a feeling of something approaching. The oldest residents believed that the river was choosing a debt to collect. That night, 7 people disappeared, quietly. No screams, no struggle. Their lanterns were found burning. Their shoes lay neatly by the riverbed. Their footprints walked straight into the still water and never returned. The next morning, the river flowed again. The sky warmed. People pretended they had slept fine. The town moved on. But in the days that followed, a new man walked the streets of Plateau. He wore the clothes of one of the missing. He carried the same basket the man once used. But his eyes were wrong. They reflected the water. After the river incident of 1865, sightings of the stranger multiplied across Plateau. Children whispered about a tall figure who stood just beyond the tree line at dusk, watching the town with a stillness that felt unnatural for any living man. Adults dismissed it as imagination, until the schoolteacher, Mrs. Bennett, encountered him herself. She was walking home late when she saw someone standing beneath the cypress trees, motionless, half-shadowed, as if carved from the night itself. She called out, thinking it was one of the farmers. The figure turned its head slowly, too slowly, as though the movement required permission. Mrs. Bennett later said she recognized the clothes. They belonged to her former student's father, one of the 7 who disappeared. She didn't stay long enough to see the figure step forward. She ran, breathless, until she reached the safety of her porch. When she turned back, The treeline was empty. But the next morning, outside her door, lay a trail of wet footprints. Footprints from bare feet. Footprints leading away from her house. But none leading toward it. That was the night the town agreed silently that they should never confront whatever walked in the woods. Because it wasn't following people for food. Or for vengeance. It was following for recognition. Like something wearing borrowed skin, waiting for someone, anyone, to call it by the wrong name, so it could exist again. And the name it followed most was the one whispered everywhere in fear. Cudjoe. In 1870, a 7-year-old boy named Elijah began waking with bruises shaped like fingers around his throat, despite sleeping alone. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply went silent. The silence lasted for weeks. Doctors from Mobile said his vocal cords were healthy. The orphanage staff insisted he was traumatized from the war. But Elijah pointed to his throat repeatedly, refusing to write or gesture anything else. One night, during a storm, the matron found him sitting upright in bed, his eyes unfocused. His mouth opened, but no sound came from him. Instead, the humming, the same slow rhythm the children had described, filled the room, vibrating the window glass, making the lamps flicker. The humming wasn't his voice. It wasn't even inside the room. Elijah stared at the wall as though someone stood on the other side. Someone only he could see. When the humming stopped, Elijah whispered for the first time in months. He stands in the river. He calls for the ones who forgot him. The matron shook him, asking who he meant. Elijah looked up with hollow eyes. He says, "His name is yours now." From that night on, Elijah refused to sleep indoors. He curled up on the porch, staring toward the river through the cypress trees. He never hummed again. But sometimes the floorboards beneath him did. The schoolteacher, shaken by her own encounter, began documenting everything she observed. Footprints, voices, sudden cold spells, shadows moving opposite the direction of lantern light. Her journal became one of the town's most disturbing artifacts. She wrote, "Something arrived that night in 1865, not a man, not a ghost, but a memory trying to take form. When we speak his name, we feed him. When we ignore him, he knocks on the edges of our thoughts. The children dream of the sea. The elders wake gasping as if lungs full of water. I do not think he comes for death. He comes for recognition." Another entry. "There are two histories of Plateau, the one we teach and the one we bury. The buried one is cracking." And her final words, written the night before she disappeared. "I saw him again today. He was standing outside the schoolhouse at noon. Noon. Shadows do not stretch long at noon, but has reached all the way to the road." The next morning, her classroom was found empty. Her journal lay open on her desk. The window was wet, but it hadn't rained. Mrs. Bennett was never seen again. By 1882, Plateau attempted to organize its post-war history. The mayor hired a historian named Dr. Roscoe Halden to collect personal testimonies. He interviewed ex-soldiers, church leaders, midwives, river workers. But every time he reached the year 1865, the testimonies became erratic. Some residents refused to speak. Some cried uncontrollably. Some insisted on locking the doors before continuing. And almost every interview contained a moment, brief, sudden, chilling, when the subject stopped mid-sentence, tilted their head, and whispered, "Do you hear that?" Dr. Halden heard nothing. Until one night, while reviewing his notes, he heard the humming beneath the floorboards. A rising, resonant tone that made the ink on his papers tremble. He slammed his journal shut and left the house. The next day, he submitted only half of his work to the town council. He left out every mention of the humming, every missing person, every strange sighting. But he kept one page for himself. On it, every interviewee had written the same phrase. He walked out of the water wearing a dead man's name. Dr. Halden resigned the following week. He left Alabama entirely. He never spoke of Plateau again. By the late 1880s, a pattern emerged at the orphanage. Every child placed in room 7 ended up sleepwalking toward the river. Caretakers had to nail the windows shut and block the hallway at night. Still, the children found ways out. One girl was discovered kneeling by the river's edge, her nightgown soaked, murmuring in a foreign dialect. When questioned, she claimed she had been answering the man who sings underwater. Another child woke up with handfuls of wet sand in his pockets, despite the orphanage being nearly a mile from the riverbank. But the most disturbing incident came from a boy named Samuel. He drew the same picture repeatedly, over 200 times, covering his walls, bed frame, and even the underside of his mattress. The picture showed a tall figure standing waist-deep in the river, arms hanging at his sides, head tilted, watching. A name was always scribbled beneath the drawing. Cudjoe. The matron destroyed the drawings. The next morning, Samuel had drawn them again, this time carved into the wooden floor with his fingernails. No one slept in room 7 after that. In 1893, Plateau experienced its strangest weather event. Residents still spoke of it decades later in hushed voices. The night began with a dry breeze. Calm, warm. Then, without warning, rain began to fall, thick, slow, and dark. It wasn't mud. It wasn't ash. It was water-stained black, leaving streaks like ink across rooftops and hands. People fled indoors, terrified. But not because of the rain itself. Because beneath the downpour, they heard humming, louder than ever before, echoing across the entire town, vibrating every window pane, shaking pews inside locked churches. Those who dared look outside swore they saw shapes walking through the darkened rain. Tall, human-like, moving with unnatural slowness, as though the world around them were water, and they were walking through the deep. And in the center of the street stood one figure, staring at the mayor's house, unmoving despite the storm pounding around him. He pointed at the door, then at the river, then at the door again. When the black rain finally ended, the figure vanished. But the mayor's youngest daughter was gone. Her shoes remained by the doorstep. Her footprints led down the street, right to the riverbank, and ended there. After the night of the black rain, Plateau's elders held a secret meeting, the first in over 20 years. They gathered in the church basement, doors locked, candles extinguished, windows covered. Only 9 people attended, each representing a founding family. No one wrote minutes. No one took notes. But one fragment survived, a torn scrap of paper shoved behind the altar, discovered decades later. On it were scribbled phrases, shaky and frantic. He wants the truth spoken. Silence feeds him. He chooses children because they do not lie. The river is not water, it is memory. And at the bottom, we must bury the name. No one speaks it again. That night, the elders burned several family records. They destroyed journals, diaries, letters, church documents. They erased all mentions of the river incident of 1865, but they failed to erase the whispers, because fear had already carved the name into the town's collective conscience. And whispers carry further than paper. By 1902, the disappearances had slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. Some believed the stranger had finally moved on. Others believed the silence meant he was closer. Then, one night in winter, 3 people returned. Not from distant towns. Not from hidden cabins. From the river. A fisherman found them standing in the water at dawn, staring blankly toward Plateau. Their clothes were intact. Their bodies uninjured. Their skin cold as stone. They had been missing for years. When questioned, each responded the same way. I walked into the river. I followed the humming. It told me to wait. Doctors examined them. Their lungs held no water. Their eyes reacted to no light. One by one, they fell asleep and never woke again. But their final breaths carried a faint sound, deep, rhythmic, and familiar. The humming. The cabin at the edge of the swamp, once belonging to the mysterious man who appeared in 1865, became a forbidden place. Children dared each other to approach it during daylight, but adults never crossed its threshold. Every attempt to open the door failed. Axes bounced off the wood. Hinges refused to break. Glass would not shatter. It was as if the cabin did not want to be opened. But in 1915, decades after it was abandoned, the sheriff's men were ordered to investigate after hearing strange reports. Humming from the woods, lights flickering in distant homes, children sleepwalking again. When they forced the door open with a steel ram, dust exploded into the air. Inside was a single wooden chair, still rocking. No wind. No footprints. Only a message carved into the dirt floor, written in jagged strokes. He never left. And beneath it, 3 symbols burned into the earth, shaped like waves. But wrong. Angular. Sharp. Like something trying to imitate water, but not understanding it. The sheriff refused to stay longer than a minute. No one went back to the cabin again. Section 16. The Woman Who Told the Truth. In 1917, an elderly woman named Ada Turner broke the pact of silence. She had been a teenager during the night the river froze still in 1865. Now near death, she sought to confess what the town had hidden. Her final statement, recorded by a visiting teacher, became the key to understanding everything. She claimed, "The man who appeared in 1865 was not a stranger. He was one of the 7 who vanished. But he did not return alive. He returned as a memory, an imprint, something caught between worlds, shaped by trauma, grief, and the unspoken horrors of the ocean crossing. A being made of collective fear, not flesh." Ada said, "When people die violently without a voice to tell their story, their pain becomes a river of its own. And sometimes it rises." She said Plateau did not face a haunting. It faced a reflection, something born from unresolved suffering. And it latched onto the strongest name it found. A name spoken often. A name tied to survival. A name whispered with reverence. Cudjoe. Not because he was the source, but because he was a vessel strong enough to hold a history the town refused to carry. And the memory wanted one thing: to be acknowledged. Ada Turner's confession stirred a fear Plateau had not felt in decades. That same year, 7 lanterns along the riverbank lit themselves at midnight. The lanterns had been used for decades. They held no oil. Their wicks were cut, yet they burned with bright, steady flames. Residents gathered in terror as the humming began again, no longer faint, but booming, echoing across the water like 1,000 distant voices rising through liquid air. 7 figures appeared in the river, not walking, not swimming, drifting upward, as though lifted by invisible hands. They formed a line along the water, facing the town. People froze. Some prayed. Some fainted. Then the central figure stepped forward, waist deep in water, head bowed. He lifted his face. He had no eyes, only 2 dark hollows filled with moving water. He opened his mouth, and a voice spoke, not his own, but layered, ancient, trembling. "Remember us." Every lantern flame went out at once. The river went still, and the figures vanished as though swallowed. The next morning, the footprints of dozens of people, bare, small, large, covered the riverbank. But not a single one led away. In 1920, a state investigator named Henry Caldwell traveled to Plateau after hearing rumors of mass hysteria. He interviewed families, reviewed missing person cases, and walked along the river. He dismissed everything as superstition, until he spent one night in the old orphanage. At 2:14 a.m., he heard humming. Not outside, not beneath the floor. Inside the room. He froze. The air grew damp. Breath misted before him. The humming circled him, moving from corner to corner, as if something invisible were pacing around his bed. He reached for his lamp, but the flame inside flickered without wind, bending toward the floorboards, as though drawn to something beneath. Terrified, Caldwell fled the room. He left Plateau before sunrise, returning to Montgomery with trembling hands and a pale face. He submitted one final report before resigning. "This is not hysteria. This is memory made manifest. The town is drowning in a story it refuses to tell." He refused to investigate further. He never stepped foot in Plateau again. By 1930, the activity in Plateau slowed once more. Fewer sightings. Fewer disappearances. The river behaved normally, except on one date, June 14th. On this day every year, just before dawn, residents woke to faint humming drifting from the river. Smooth, slow, heavy with longing. Those brave enough to stand near the bank described a strange sight. Ripples forming perfect circles, expanding outward, as though someone just beneath the surface exhaled calmly, peacefully. The humming never grew violent, never rose in volume. It sounded like someone singing a lullaby to the past. Some believed the presence had finally found rest. Others believed it was waiting for one last voice to answer. A few elders whispered that the memory had grown tired of haunting, tired of being forgotten, tired of the silence it fed upon. They believed it would fade only when someone spoke the full truth aloud. But no one dared, because speaking truth meant reopening what the town had buried. And Plateau feared one thing more than haunting: being reminded of what it had done. In 1915, the day the cabin door opened, the rocking chair moved not from wind, but from recognition. Something inside the cabin understood that the pact of silence had weakened, and the message carved into the floor, "He never left," was not a warning. It was a plea to be remembered correctly. The presence haunting Plateau was not a monster, spirit, or curse. It was a collective echo born from trauma, an unspoken story that refused to stay buried. It attached itself to a name that symbolized survival because that name carried strength. The elders tried to erase the past. The orphanage tried to silence the children. The church tried to hide the records. The families tried to forget. But memory has weight, and the river carries everything we refuse to confront. Cudjoe, the symbolic vessel, became the form that memory took. Not because he caused the fear, but because fear needed a shape that would not die until someone acknowledged the truth. That suffering does not disappear when ignored. It echoes. It rises. It waits. It returns. And sometimes it takes 50 years or more before the living finally listen. Tonight, you opened the forgotten files. Tonight, you stepped into Plateau's river of memory. And once you hear the humming, you never forget it. Because the past never leaves. It waits for you to say its name.